They called me a murderer before I could say my name. I remember the first thing I tasted that morning. Stale coffee. Someone had left on the windowsill, the couple attempts of panic rising in my mouth. Like a second breath, Luyura was on the tile, her hand clamped to a white towel. Blood soaked the cloth, and the kitchen seemed to tilt, the way rooms tilt when you know gravity has a new opinion about who should stand and who should fall. My family filled the doorway like a jury. Faces pulled tight, eyes bright with accusation. "You did this," my mother said. It was not a question. That single sentence changed everything. In a single inhale, they had a name for me now. The one who hurts her sister. The one who brought shame. The one who would be cut away to preserve the rest. Hands pushed past me. Someone shoved a camera into my face. An employee from the company live streaming the house because every family drama was content now. Bites of humiliation for shareholders and relatives who could not wait to pick a side. A maintenance guard whispered that a video of the incident had already been uploaded to the private board. The board would vote that afternoon on my place in the company I had grown up hearing about at every breakfast table. Someone else, a cousin with a phone, played a clipped, shaking video on loop. Luyura falling, a bottle at her side, a face cut into the frame like a witness. I felt the room tilt again, this time away from me as if the house itself were telling me to leave. They did not ask if I had been at dinner or who I had spoken to that morning. They did not wait for the police to take statements, or for doctors to tell them what had happened. They closed their mouths, as if silence itself was justice. And in that silence the accusations hardened. They threw me out of the house, like a bad memory. I stood on the driveway under a sky the color of untarnished metal, clutching a small bag of things I had packed in a blur. Mother stood on the porch with Lu Yunfang's new scarf, wrapped around her throat like a sigil. Father did not look at me. He turned his head once, slow as a judge pronouncing sentence, and inside his eyes I saw a ledger balancing reputations against bloodlines. The company would vote. The board would decide. The police would come. The world that had been mine felt small and brittle, as if someone had taken a photograph and left me outside the frame. If this is speaking to you, subscribe, and stay with me through everything that comes next. I slept on a couch in a friend's apartment that night, and woke to a dozen headlines I had not written. Scandal at the Liu family estate. Accused. Who will lead the company now? The more public pieces described my walk out the door as a furious reaction from someone with something to hide. One news anchor called it a long simmering resentment. Finally, boiled over. Whoever typed that likely had never seen how my father would choose his favorite like a gardener, choosing which rows to nurture and which to trim. They painted my life with a single stroke, and then used that stroke to erase everything else. The first hours were a storm. Police took statements, scribbling in thick characters on flimsy pads. A detective asked me the same questions 3 times, with the patient cool of someone cataloging debris. Where were you at 9? Who saw you last touch anything? Did you have any reason to hurt your sister? The questions were practical, but between them the room hummed louder with the rumor machine. Security footage had been presented to the family earlier, a hospital report. According to someone who wanted to make sure all sides were covered. Suggested negligence, a chemical trace. The family lawyer called me for a meeting and then did not show. A shareholder committee used the videos and the report in a meeting that evening to formally table a vote, to strip me of my role and any inheritance rights pending investigation. I remember thinking, in one hollow moment alone, that if they could do this without asking me even once, what else could they do with my silence? The backstory, the boxed-up truth, that fits snugly into the headlines, was deep as habit. My sister, Luyura, had always been the favored one, not because she was cruel or even charming, though she could be both depending on the plate and the audience, but because she fit our family's idea of what success looked like. Marriage to someone with a tidy surname, babies photographed on glossy brochures, a smile that never lingered past its broadcast. I was younger, quieter, the one who had learned to keep hands working so everyone else could argue about paper and profits. There were little injustices that stacked like unpaid bills. I remember the way my father's praise would fall heavier on Euro at the dinner table. A modest praise, a comment threaded with approval, then a warm look in her direction that said everything about who had the keys. When I gave up my college dorm to house a relative for a semester, no one announced a party in my honor. When I chose to work late, the year the company faltered and my paychecks went to settle contractors, applause was reserved for those with suits and press releases. Family favoritism is ordinary cruelty. It is practiced in private, and then marketed as tradition. It is rarely dramatic. It is slow and precise. A slow-acting detergent that fades your edges, while the favored one is ironed crisply. So when the accusation fell, many in the house were ready to fill the necessary gaps. My past service became motive. My silence became guilt. It templated the story for anyone who wanted it neat. The first week following the incident was an economy of humiliation. The board voted in fast, clinical motions, voices, doleless tax filings. They froze my access to company accounts, revoked my email, and posted bulletins about protecting shareholder value. The company's security chief, a man who had always looked at me with the polite suspicion factories reserved for their youngest workers, was suddenly more efficient, in the eyes of the family and the public. The facts were a narrow path. There was a video. There was a hospital report. There was a demographic of resentment, pointing straight at me. The longer I stood in the frame they drew, the more convinced people became. I spent days moving between terse interrogations and rooms, too quiet for the kind of thinking that heals anything. I learned which versions of me were allowed in public. The tearful one, the defiant one, the mute one. I took notes. In a cheap notebook, I wrote down everything that smelled like evidence. The morning the surveillance feed cut out, the way the hospital report used a field I had never seen in any legitimate chart, a folder on the company's server titled Family Private that had suddenly been locked to me. Small things. Insignificant individually, huge when lined up like coffins. Each time I found a detail, disbelief greeted me. "You expect them to believe you?" asked a cousin over coffee, as if I had invented gravity to play with their schedules. At shareholders' meetings, when I tried to speak, security would announce the room closed. Someone had already been called to present the official materials. They read words into the record that felt like clamps, phrases written by lawyers who were careful to be technically true while morally bankrupt. I thought about leaving, disappearing so the story could not touch me. But the family's move had been strategic. They wanted to seal the leak that I might expose. Their goal was not only to remove me, it was to make my silence permanent and profitable to the rest of them. If I left, the narrative would harden. She fled because she was guilty. I made a different promise. In the middle of a night when the city was a soft machine hum beyond the window, I whispered to the dark, the only oath I could justify. I would not be a rumor on a board. I would not be a headline without a face. I would find the places where the story had been stitched together, and pull the seams. The investigation started like a scavenger hunt, and turned into a slow, patient unpeeling. I had nowhere near the resources my family could mobilize. What I had was persistence, and an uncomfortable clarity about what people used to decide stories they liked. The first clue was the CCTV. During the family meeting when the video was shown, I watched as a grainy clip played in a loop. Euro walking into the kitchen. A short flurry of movement, the drop. The footage had a tight angle, and the camera seemed to know precisely where to point, as if the camera had been told what to catch. Later, when I asked to see the raw files, simply to compare what was shown to the server copy, I was told with a smile that the raw was unavailable. The security chief mentioned an automatic overwrite, configured to save only 30 days of footage. "We've closed the case on this camera," he said. All protocol followed. It felt too neat. May was the one who spoke up first. She had been our housemaid for 12 years. the kind of person who knew where the spare keys were hidden, and how the family positioned themselves on holidays. She pulled me off to the side in the back staircase the day after I was dismissed. Her fingers red from washing a dozen napkins, she lowered her voice. "The backup is in the guardroom," she said. "But last week someone came through with a company key and sat at the monitor all night. I thought it was Mr. Zhang from security, but his badge didn't light up on the console. He left early in the morning, when the sun came. The door was unlocked after. It was the sort of thing people ignore when they want their lives to continue feeling tidy." I did not ignore it. May agreed to help me get access to the guardroom, insisting that loyalty to truth was worth a small risk. Her eyes were not heroic. They were tired in a way I understood. She had watched the family take things for years. Love, leftover table scraps, the dignity of people who live by honest work. She did not want to watch them throw that dignity away for a story. We went the next night. The guardroom was a small chamber of screens and static, a shrine to surveillance. The consoles hummed under dust. On the main monitor, the clip the family had played at the meeting was queued in a media player, but the file on the local drive was not the clip I had watched projected on the wall. It was labeled with a timestamp that matched the morning of the incident, yet the header, the metadata that read like a filed biography, had been edited in a way that made no technical sense for a system that archived raw feed. Where a raw file should show frame counts and device IDs, someone had grafted metadata, a series of edits, a software tag, an account name that did not belong to any guard on duty. I copied the file to a USB drive, like a thief in the night. The sensation was ridiculous and small, and enormous all at once. My hands shook as the transfer bar crawled. I left May sitting on a stool, a figure in the blue light of monitors, and tucked the drive into my bag. At home that night, or the spare bed that had become mine, I pulled the file into a laptop that belonged to a friend who owed me favors. The footage looked like the one the family had played, but when I opened Properties, one of the fields showed a post-processing tag, the name of an editing suite, and a user account. Whoever put that tag there had used the Enterprise Solution our company license for corporate presentations. It was not the kind of software a guard would install on a tacky monitor. I did something I had never done before. I messaged someone at the company whose work had always been invisible to me. Aaron had been head of IT until last year when a reorganization pushed him into a quieter consultancy role. He owed me nothing. He did not know me as someone worth helping, except for old habit and one quiet human mistake. Years ago in college I had fixed his bike when it broke down for him on a rainy night. He had once said, half joking, that I had a good problem-solving face. Maybe that was a silly reason to pick him. Maybe I was simply desperate. He answered my message at 2 a.m. "Send it," he wrote. When he called back, his voice was a calm instrument. "This file has markers," he said. Someone opened the RAW and exported a clip, added a few frames, then re-encoded it. The export user shows an enterprise license keyed to an account that belongs to a corporate admin. An admin? I repeated. The word was like an alarm I had not known how to hear. Someone with access, Aaron said. Whoever has admin credentials can touch files in ways a frontline guard cannot. If you got the RAW from the guardroom, someone either placed the edited file there later, or the guard system was used to store the export. Both are messy. Both smelled like intentional planting. When he said, planting, something cold and animal slid up the spine of my hope. Planting meant this had been planned. Planting meant someone had decided it would be useful to make me look guilty. Planting meant evidence. There was more. The metadata showed a username that matched a company email, a generic label, something like admin, family or family.private. The sort of label that might exist for a private folder accessible to family members who also had corporate privileges. The name alone was not proof. An account must log in from somewhere. Aaron traced the login through the internal logs and found an origin IP that resolved to a device inside the Lu estate. Which device? I asked. Indefinido. Aaron hesitated, and then said, carefully. I can see the login came from a local IP. It resolves to a house server, but the logs then show it was proxied, through a corporate VPN, at the time of the export. The person accessed the local server, then mediated the file through a company route, to mask entry. Whoever did that used credentials that my script lists as valid for several corporate roles. You've got a trail that runs home, then runs back into the company. Being able to trace the login to the estate sounded like victory. But it also widened the map of suspects, in a way that terrified me. Whoever had the keys to do that, had both physical and digital access. That could be someone with privilege in the house. It could be someone with a corporate role. It could be anyone capable of crossing both domains. A scar they wore in identical places. The next days unfolded in two rhythms. I tried to speak to anyone who would listen, and then crawled back into the small lab of evidence we were building. May watched the house with a kind of squirrel-like vigilance. She reported who came in and out, and what lights stayed on until late. Aaron dug into logs, and pulled out strings of activity that looked like a birdcage of patterns. Who logged in at odd hours, which machines connected to the estate server, which accounts were used that should not have been. Jiu Yanning came into the frame more than anyone else. He was the kind of man who knew how to smile for cameras, and frown for tabloids. He spoke in public, like a man who had been schooled to look properly concerned. When I confronted him in the hospital corridor, where Euro had been taken. Because I could not stay away, because the air of the place had both the antiseptic and the grief that made it a hive of human truth. He did not meet my eyes. Did you ask anyone what happened? I said. Quiet at first, then tilt raising. Did you watch what you showed the board? He said nothing for a long moment. A small human silence where guilt might have lived. Then he said, with a practiced softness, we presented what we had. The family had to act. I saw the footage, I said. Where did you get it? He shrugged delicately. From the security room, from CACTV. His voice clean as glass, and the hospital report. I pressed. Who issued that? We had a preliminary statement from the attending physician, he said. It was compiled by the legal team. He was careful, too careful. He avoided any ownership of what had been presented. He used "we" as a shield. I left him in the corridor with Euros for humming like a small, pitiless machine. The more I probed, the more I found people who used passive voice like talismans. It was decided. It was presented. It was compiled. Whoever used "we", most often in that family, always turned the maintenance of guilt into the community's act. And in that way, kindness and cruelty became indistinguishable. Setbacks were frequent and heavy. At a preliminary hearing I was the one who looked guilty even while I produced evidence that made eyebrows raise. The security chief, with his thick, unflinching manner, said the server had been automatically updated, and that any alterations could have been from an external source. The family lawyer, a man with quick teeth and simpering politeness, characterized my evidence as an attempt to muddy settled facts. The police inspector who had come to the house the first day was careful to keep things open. But the word open in official mouths is often the polite envelope delivered to families who already have agendas. There were other moments of humiliation that stung in different places. A shareholder livestream announced a vote to suspend my privileges in the company. The chat filled with people who had never once written me a note of kindness, demanding accountability. I tried to speak to the board through the company's counsel and was told the hearing could not be interrupted. I leaned into my old colleagues for help, and some turned away the moment a family member told them the story was complicated. In one low moment, sitting in a laundromat, with laundry in a basket, like a slow, domestic moat, I texted Jiu Yanning, a simple line. If you didn't do this, help me find who did. His reply was a string of platitudes, about privacy and process. There was no empathy. There was sympathy in a corporate template. May stayed close. She began to show me small kindnesses that were as practical as they were brave. A forgotten access key she had kept. The name of a security guard who liked to gamble after hours. An old receipt for a vendor who serviced the house's server. Each item felt like a splintered world of possibility. Alone, they were not enough. Together, they formed a map. Together, they suggested there was someone who had physically touched both the cameras and the server. Whoever that was had the kind of trust the family gave to selected people. And that narrowed the suspect list. Frighteningly close to the heart. At the heart of everything was the hospital record. The document the family's legal team had presented was clinical in its language, but specific in its conclusions. It suggested a series of neglects and exposures that, read by anyone without access to the raw charts, looked damning. But when Aaron compared the document to the original template the hospital used for such incidents, he found discrepancies. Fields that had been filled with shorthand the clinic never used, a stamp that had a slight misalignment. The sort of error a forger would either avoid or be clumsy about. It did not mean the hospital had been falsified entirely. It meant someone had had the time and confidence to make changes that would survive the first cursory reading. Why would they bother? I asked him. To make a narrative that claims you were neglectful, he said. You can make things look like they happened the way you want. If you can control the documents people read. Control. That word kept coming back to me. My family believed in controlling narratives. They had always controlled how the world saw us. Through philanthropy notes and management statements and dinners with the right photographers. They controlled who had access to which rooms. They controlled what the company said. Publicly, now they were controlling my past and my future, by directing the flow of information. There were nights I sat on the fire escape and watched the city flare and dim. I would open the cheap notebook I had bought in the first days, and lay out a plan like a spy who had been elevated by circumstance. Step 1. Get independent copies of the hospital's chart. Step 2. Retrieve raw surveillance archives from the guardroom. Step 3. Trace logins and find human hands on the devices. Step 4. Find a witness who would speak without fear. Each step felt more dangerous than the last. Each step edged me closer to people with more power than I had. I started to notice the small things that often betray people who think they are clever. A house guest who wore a company-branded sweater when they should have been anonymous. A servo patch scheduled at 3 in the morning when it should have been at noon. A handwriting on a file folder that was nearly identical to an executive assistant's. None of those were a smoking gun, but they were threads. The first real breakthrough arrived in the form of an old backup drive that belonged to a security guard who had been let go 2 months before the incident. He had kept a small backup at home, because he did not trust the system he had been asked to monitor. May found him at a table in a noodle shop, and convinced him to let us see it. He had been frightened to speak publicly. He had family, and he owed debts. But he handed the drive with a look that said he understood what might happen to him if he did not. Aaron took the drive to his studio. The files were messy. It felt like going through a cemetery, where the headstones had been knocked and reordered. But there was one folder that contained a raw cut that did not match the clips shown at the meeting. It was longer. Contained frames, before the ones shown publicly, and in those frames, a shadow passed across the camera. A shape like a coat, or a person. Immediately before that, a timestamp showed a log entry. An exportation event triggered by a system account. The name was a generic tag that returned to a company mailbox. The origin IP was local. We were close. Closeness in this case was not safety. It meant we had a mystery that would be dangerous to dig into. On a rainy morning when even the birds seemed sheepish, I brought the file to a lawyer. I could trust an old professor who had retired from practice but kept a quiet office for cases that mattered to him. He did not ask for money. He asked for the file and sat through it like a man reading the weather in the palms of his hands. When he finished, he tapped the table and said, You have a plausible account for tampering. We can compel forensic analysis. We can get subpoenas for logs. But remember, the moment you move, the family will move back twice as fast. His words were not discouraging as much as they were strategic. The family had power and habit. We were, in many ways, improvising resistance. At times the anger burned so bright I could not sleep. I wanted to call out each person who had smiled as I was escorted out of the house. I wanted to put the edited footage and the forged report on the table in front of them, and watch their faces change, from smugness to rawness. But words are cheap, and evidence is not. Evidence is a document with a trail you can trace. Evidence is a log with an IP that resolves to a device. Evidence is the merciless fact that someone accessed files using credentials they should not have, and evidence is what would, if properly presented, reverse my fate. There were moments of loneliness that felt like being thawed out in public. Friends who feared being collateral, colleagues citing conflict of interest, relatives who disappeared like mist when cameras flashed. But there were also small acts of loyalty that mattered more than I expected. May brought me a thermos of soup. Aaron spent paychecks he did not have on consultants who could parse file headers. The retired lawyer walked into a meeting with a binder and a face like dry winter wood. We started to gather pieces that fit together. A recorded export, a hospital chart with Caped language, a guard whose timeline of duty did not match the logs, an editing suite license purchased from a corporate account. We had motive in a theological sense. Family preservation. The clearing of a potential obstacle to inheritance. We had opportunity. Access to security systems, and the house server. We had the evidences sent. But we did not yet have the one thing that could bring it crashing down. A clear chain of custody, and a human confession, or a log, showing the exact account used and the person who authenticated it. And then, in the quiet, between two attempts to petition the board, I received a message that made my hands go translucent with its possibility. Aaron sent a screenshot. A snapshot of the estate's internal log showing an admin login at 3:07 a.m. On the morning of the incident, the login came from the house server and then proxied out through a corporate VPN. The user field was an email that, on our internal roster, corresponded to a corporate admin we knew by sight. Which admin? I asked. Indefinido. The name in the log was a coded label the company used for family access. The translation required permissions, Aaron said. We did not yet have. It was a half door, ajar. I sat at the small table in my friend's kitchen, and let the rain do what rain does. Wash the grime into fine lines across the window. The pieces we had made a picture that was beginning to look like a portrait of a conspiracy. It did not feel decisive. It felt like a moment, right before the storm breaks. All the elements are in the sky, circling and building. I thought of what my father would do if he knew the details of the logs. I thought of how Jiyu Yanning stood in the corridor, his hands folded in a polite manner. I thought of Lu Yunfeng at the window, looking out at the same sky, imagining reputation as a fence to keep shame away. I thought of the way my silence had been converted into evidence against me, and the way I had been dismissed from the table where my past had been negotiated. When you are accused by those closest to you, doubt is the first tool they use. When your family uses that doubt, it becomes a public thing. I had never expected that watching my life be rewritten would demand the sort of patience that digging up the foundation of a house requires. Slow, precise, careful not to trigger a collapse that will bury other things. But I was learning how to dig. May found a name in a ledger that showed who had serviced the estate server the month before the incident. It was an IT company contracted through a friend of the family. The invoice had been paid with the family's private account. The technician had left a small note about security module replacement. The note was brief, the sort of corporate shorthand that hides implications. Replaced, patched, verified. I called the technician and left a message. I did not mention the family name. He responded within the hour. sounding like a man who had never been asked to lie in an important place. "Yes," he said. "We came out that night." The family wanted the security module moved to a different VLAN for privacy reasons. They insisted on a protocol that kept those logs accessible to the household admin. "Who requested the change?" I asked. He paused. The request came from an account tied to the estate server. The email had the family domain. "Which family account?" "Indefinido." He used the avoidance of small men who have paid bills to the wrong people. He said it was an estate email, not a specific person. The technician was useful and useless in the same breath. He confirmed changes, but he could not, or would not say, who had specifically authorized them. Sometimes lines are left purposely blurry. I felt as if I were painting in thin watercolors over a photograph. The image was there, but nothing would be decisive until we could darken the lines. I told myself the first thing I would need when we did have the proof. Public space. The family had made the accusation in the public rooms because they could. They had streamed the grief, and then used it to shift a board vote. That publicness had been weaponized. If we wanted to reverse fate, the reversal would need to be public too. But different. Slow, factual, and undeniable. I thought about the shareholder meeting that would come in a fortnight. The meeting had become a kind of altar for what the family wanted the world to see. I imagined standing there with a stack of printouts, and a lawyer who could speak plainly about logs, about edits, about proxies. I imagined playing the raw file, then the edited one, then the difference. I imagined a court of people who could not be as easily moved by reputation as they could by clear, audible facts. Imagining it was easy. Executing it would require courage, patience, and proof, threaded like a lifeline. I slept badly that week. I dreamed of a camera lens in the kitchen focusing on me like an accusation. I woke with the taste of metal again, but now that taste was edged with something else. Resolute. The people who had hurt me had assumed silence. They had believed that family ties could be bent to any shape. They had not accounted for stubbornness that comes from being pushed to the edge. One night, after a fruitless day of hearing safe answers from those I thought might help, I found a small object that should not have been in the glove box of a company car. A white pill bottle with a smudged label. It was not the clue I expected. It did not, on paper, prove anything about the hospital event. It did not tell me how a medical chart had been altered, or who had edited the CCTV. But it had fingerprints in the cap. And when Aaron checked the lab, one of the prints matched a print on a paperwork folder in the estate office. A finger in a lock. Fingerprints in a place where people who belong leave traces. A small, domestic truth among the big fabrications. I felt my resolve grow like a muscle that had been unused. It was not about vengeance. It was about being known as I was, not as the family wanted me to be known. It was about unmaking a story that had been written in the quick ink of assumption and editing. We were not yet ready for a public reveal. We could not safely shout forgery and expect everyone to listen. But we had enough to begin to tilt the board of belief, to make people who had accepted the staged version squint and wonder. A single grain sometimes cracks a dam. At the center of it all pulsed a single raw question that refused to be answered for me. Who had taken the tools of family and company and used them to make me guilty? Indefinido. That was the thread we needed to pull. It was invisible, and then again, almost visible. A login here, a server patch there, an editing signature, a technician's invoice. The map was half drawn, smeared in places by those who wanted it to stay unclear. I had a thread. It was thin and taut, the kind you could easily cut if you did not know how to follow it. But I had learned, painfully, to see where strings attached themselves to a thing, and I tugged. Block 4. Setbacks and isolation continued. We pushed our little case forward, with the slowness of people moving through molasses. Every small victory produced 2 new obstacles. The family lawyer answered our subpoenas with motions. The company counsel threatened to sue Aaron for unauthorized access to corporate property. The retired lawyer who had agreed to help quietly received calls from former colleagues, reminding him of the costs of upsetting the wrong people. Even May, whose courage had been steadier than I deserved, began to look smaller in doorways when a cousin came by and said, without face-splitting malice, "People like things tidy. You're making things messy." There were nights I sat in my friend's tiny kitchen and watched the city light come through the blinds and count the hours like penalties. I watched my phone fill with messages from strangers who had read the headlines and felt some odd mixture of righteousness and appetite. They wanted updates, details, a narrative that fit into 200 characters. I tried to answer with patience. I tried to answer with fact. I kept returning to the notebook, and the lists and the way small details began to line up. The police inspector who took our complaint initially was a careful man. He wanted proof, not spectacle. But proof costs time, and time is a currency my family could spend faster than we could earn it. "We will reopen the logs," he said. And it was the sort of answer that tasted like a promise you offered a child to keep them quiet. The first subpoena we issued for server logs was met with a motion from the Estates Council arguing invasion of privacy and procedural irregularities. The board closed ranks and decided to wait on independent review. Meanwhile, the smear machine ran on autopilot. Anonymous social posts asked if I had ever been jealous of my sister. A gossip column ran a piece about old resentments in wealthy households. A talk show host used our family photograph as a prop about how money can warp blood. Each piece of content was a little stone in the lake of public opinion, making darker circles that reached out to drown me. In the face of that, I began to feel a strange gratitude to small, honest people. Aaron stayed awake through the night pulling strings from log files. He explained things to me in ways that made my lungs unclench. What a proxy meant without using the word, like a hammer. What a metadata tag could show, without pretending to be the whole truth. May did what she had always done. She kept the practical work of truth-telling from collapsing. She remembered times. She produced receipts. She found a guard who had been paid in cash to stay quiet. The retired lawyer drew the right kind of public attention by filing a narrow, surgical motion, a request for forensic analysis, and a protection order to keep assets from being moved. While audits were in progress, when the family pushed back hard, we felt it. The Estates Council answered our motion with an attack on our witnesses' credibility. The guard who had kept a backup drive came to court and froze, suddenly worried about losing his job or losing face in the neighborhood. He almost withdrew his statement. I had to sit with him in a corridor and speak like someone calming a cat. The guard's hands trembled as he signed again. It was a lesson in how fragile courage is when the cost becomes real. There were moments I thought about walking away. Imagine how clear that would look to everyone. She fled. Therefore, she was guilty. But that logic, the very instrument my family had used to shape the first verdict, was the reason I did not leave. Leaving would be the same as surrender. I wanted to take back the quiet dignity my family had converted into evidence against me. Block 5. Breakthrough and evidence gathering. The breakthrough was not cinematic. It did not arrive with a single, dramatic confession. It came as a slow piling up of small, undeniable things that together formed a dam against the river of lies. First, the forensic lab returned Aaron's request with findings written in careful formal language that hid how much of my relief it contained. The lab's report confirmed the editing signatures. The CCTV clip had been exported, re-encoded, and re-stamped with a new header. The raw file the family played had been modified. The export user was tied to a corporate admin account. The paywall we had feared was beginning to crack. Second, a nurse who had been on duty the night Lou Euro was admitted agreed to come forward. She was a small woman with hands that made the right kind of noise when she signed documents. She did not want cameras. She did not want headlines. She wanted to correct an error. She testified, quietly, and with a professional exhaustion, that the emergency notes she had written the night of the incident did not, in her handwriting, include the text that later appeared on the family's hospital report. That report, she said, had wording that did not follow hospital protocol. That was not an accusation so much as a professional fact. A hospital clerk corroborated that certain fields in the report had been entered after the time the nurse had left. Third, Aaron traced the proxy routes and found a string we had not noticed. A series of logins the night before the incident that connected a device registered to Jiu Yanning's company laptop to the estate server. The device identifiers matched a laptop he frequently used in both public appearances and private correspondence. The login trail showed that an admin account linked to the family's private domain authenticated a session minutes before the CCTV export occurred. The login then passed through a corporate network the family owned. The logs placed a device he owned in proximity to the estate server at the relevant hour. It was not a confession. It was a technical set of breadcrumbs that, to any reasonable investigator, suggested opportunity and means. We took the findings to our lawyer, who filed an emergency motion to present this evidence at the upcoming shareholder meeting. The board balked. The estate council argued that presenting forensic evidence in that forum would be prejudicial and inappropriate, but the retired lawyer argued back, quietly, and with an authority that carried weight among older men, who remembered a different era of professional honor. If the family would use the shareholder meeting to penalize me based on forged materials, then a public forum was the proper place to expose the forgeries. The shareholders, it turned out, were less interested in protecting a family secret than they were in preserving the company's reputation and avoiding legal exposure. The meeting would be convened, but with a condition: a neutral forensic expert would be allowed to address the assembly. The board hoped this would quiet things. They misjudged how sharp facts could be when laid plainly. Block 6. Climactic reveal. The shareholder meeting was not the altar the family had intended it to be. The room hummed with the noise of bodies restless under the weight of money and gossip. Cameras dotted the ceiling. Media outlets queued outside. The board took their places, each face a learned instrument. My father sat at the end of the table with the kind of practice to neutrality that had always been a kind of defense mechanism. Liu Yunfeng, my mother, looked like someone holding a bargain between her teeth. When our forensic expert stood, he began not with accusation, but with method. He explained the chain of custody, what a raw file should contain, and how an edited export appears to an investigator. He played the clip shown at the family meeting first, the one everyone had taken as proof. It looped, grainy and precise in its omissions. Then, with a steady authority, he played the raw footage from the backup drive we had recovered. The two were juxtaposed. One longer, one shorter, one with a shadow that crossed the camera before the moment shown in the edited clip. You could hear a different kind of silence settle. It was the silence that comes when something a crowd believed is shown to be built on scaffolding. On the raw footage, the experts said, there is a frame showing a person entering the server room hallway with an object in their hand. The exported clip begins after that frame. The exported file's metadata indicates it was created by an account associated with the family's corporate admin permissions. The export was proxied through the company's VPN, using a device identifier that resolves to Mr. Zhu Yanning's assigned laptop. The room inhaled in unison. Zhu Yanning's smile thinned. His hands, which had been folded as if for prayer, tightened. Those logs can be spoofed, he said. It was not a denial so much as a legal maneuver, a reflex of someone who had been coached in defense. The expert answered, dry and careful. Spoofing is possible, but this trail includes device MAC registration, local server access, and a sequence of authenticated sessions. Further, we have corroborating testimony from a security guard who placed Mr. Zhu in the server corridor at 2:58 a.m. He saw Mr. Zhu leave with a small container. Jiu Yanning's face shifted. It was a small movement, the flinch of a man who had been looking down at his hands and felt something pull them away. The nice man voice he used in interviews cracked. He said, "This is absurd." My mother's face, which had been an even map of controlled outrage, softened into something like realization. Her lips moved, as if searching for an explanation she had already decided she did not want. My father did not look at me. He looked at Ju Yaning the way you look at a weather event. A force you can measure but not necessarily stop. Then the nurse, called to the stand by our lawyer, gave her testimony again, this time in front of media and shareholders. She explained the hospital chart discrepancies and the timing of entries. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Facts have a way of being louder than complaint. One shareholder stood up, a person who had been quiet through all the manipulations, and asked the board directly if they had considered the legal exposure of presenting unverified materials in a vote to strip a family member of rights. "Have you thought about the cost of being wrong?" she asked. Her question landed like a hand on each face. Added to the montage was a piece of evidence I had not expected. The technician who had installed the security module testified that he had been directed through an estate account to make changes that would give the household admin extended privileges. He had questioned it at the time, but the woman who reached out to him insisted. The email, when recovered, matched the family domain, and the server logs confirmed the same signature. The technician's hands shook as he showed his invoice and the note that read, "Requested by estate admin." Faces in the room moved in sequences I watched like a chessboard. Ji Yaning stood first, then sat. He spoke to a lawyer, and was silent for long stretches. The family lawyer attempted to reframe the narrative as a misunderstanding, and said we should delay judgment until the police had finished their work. Delays had always been their strategy. Time was a kind of eraser, when you had the means to paint new pictures. The retired lawyer I had recruited did not pounce. He simply pointed to the timeline and the technical records, and asked, plainly and without flourish, who had the most to gain from my removal. It was a surgical question, one that did not need theatrics. It left space for the answer to be rational. When the first person who materially benefited from the outcome, and whose device matched the logins, stammered and offered excuses, the coherence of our case became a visible thing. The room tilted. The board voted to halt the suspension pending a full independent inquiry. Shareholders murmured. The media wrote sharp headlines. The police, prompted by the public exposure and the forensic findings, announced they would reopen their investigation with new leads to follow. I could feel the world rearranging itself. It was not that everyone loved me now. It was not that trust came back in an instant. But the machinery that had been used to make me guilty was now being examined by others, with power to do something about what they found. Immediate fallout was messy and human. Jiu Yaning faced a barrage of questions he could not answer, with the same composure. The family advisor who had encouraged a quick vote stood down. My mother wept in private, in a small room off the board floor. Not in raw blame but in the slow ache of recognition that she had been complicit in something she had not fully understood. The father retreated into silence, which sometimes felt more audible than any statement. The inspector, who had been cautious, became more deliberate. He issued orders for full forensic audits and subpoenas for the devices involved. The Estates Council tried to make peace by proposing an internal review. Our lawyer refused and demanded an independent panel. The shareholders, whose concern had shifted from spectacle to liability, sided with independence. The board paused the vote. Full stop. Block 7. Resolution and reflection. What followed was not a courtroom drama, full of nailed-down confessions. It was a legal, bureaucratic, and moral unpicking of the tricks that had been used to cast me as villain. The police investigation widened to include not only the edited footage, but the hospital chart manipulations, and the pattern of privilege that allowed someone to access both the house and corporate systems with ease. The independent forensic team produced a report that confirmed manipulation and traced the editing account to a device that, in the company's asset register, belonged to G. The report stopped short of saying who had pressed the keys. No forensic team can read intent, but it placed a very heavy finger on the most likely origin. The company placed those implicated on temporary leave. The board named an independent committee to audit family-related governance. The estate's council found themselves in meetings with investigators and, less glamorously, with insurance people, calculating exposure. The retired lawyer who had refused money looked tired but satisfied in a way I had not expected to see him. I was not crowned in a public ceremony. There was no triumphant music. There was a small, formal letter that came a week after the shareholder meeting, an apology on behalf of the board for the premature actions, and an offer to restore my account privileges, pending the outcome of the investigations. The wording of official apologies is always careful. It is the sort of document that keeps one foot out the door, but it was something I had not thought I would see. There were legal steps I insisted upon. I wanted not revenge, but accountability. I filed civil claims to hold people responsible for the costs they had imposed on me, and to demand a forensic accounting of how estate resources had been used to manufacture the narrative against me. The police continued their criminal inquiries. I will not pretend the papers and motions and depositions did not take time and grit. They did. They took the sort of patience that wears you thin in weeks and then strengthens you in months. What happened inside the family after the public reversal was the kind of slow unmaking you cannot dramatize easily. People stopped behaving with the same polished confidence. Conversations became longer. There were attempts at reconciliation that felt more like insurance negotiations than healing. My mother came to me one evening and said, "I thought I was protecting the family." Her voice was small. "I thought if we acted quickly, things would be contained." "I know," I said, "but you protected an idea of us more than us." We spoke about favor and duty, and the shape of love in our house. She did not excuse herself. She explained as people who are waking up to a wrong explain to someone they have hurt. It was not absolution, it was an opening. For the first time in years I felt her eyes on me, not as if seeing a liability to manage, but as if seeing a person she had failed to understand. There were others who did not ask for forgiveness. There were cousins who clogged their phones, and aunts who ducked my presence at funerals. That was their choice. I grieved that. But I also realized that family can be both refuge and weapon. I would take refuge where it was offered, and build boundaries where it was not. When the police finally called, to say the investigation had produced enough evidence to forward certain charges to the prosecutor, I sat at the same small table where I had written my plan weeks earlier, and breathed, like a person who had climbed a steep, hazardous staircase. The state would decide the rest. I did not celebrate. I did not gloat. There was a hard, clean clarity to the moment. Someone had used trust like a tool to harm me. That truth had been exposed in a way that required process, not spectacle. In the months that followed, my name, my actual name, the one my mother had taught me to sign with a flourish when I was small, returned in documents as a fact, rather than an allegation. The company reinstated my access and offered a settlement for damages. I took some. I declined other things. I declined, in the end, to return to the same seat at the board I had once occupied because I had learned that a seat at the table does not equal power over the story of your life. Instead, I negotiated safeguards. Transparent governance around family-related accounts, independent oversight, and clauses that prevented rapid, unilateral decisions under private influence. There were emotional costs that no document could fix. The nights I had sat alone watching the city were catalogued like a private inventory of losses. Friends who left, trust that fractured, the taste that returned to my mouth in moments of stress. But there was also an accrued confidence. The strange tensile strength you get when you have been pressed and did not break. I learned to recognize my own voice again. I learned the difference between the sound of panic and the sound of resolve. I did not become someone without scars, I became someone with a history that did not end in shame. That was different. That was something like a blessing. After everything, I considered what to do with the leverage I had. Reinstatement could have been a return to the life I had known. The one full of meetings and glossy dinners, and carefully managed philanthropy. Instead, I chose a different path. I used part of the settlement, and some regained assets, to start a small nonprofit that supports employees and household staff who find themselves caught in conflicts between family and employer. It felt modest and necessary to me, a way to transform the pain I had endured into something that made it harder for the same thing to happen to someone else. The people who helped me, Aaron, May, the retired lawyer, asked for nothing beyond my gratitude. Aaron returned to consulting but remained a friend who checked in. May assumed a more formal role assisting in the new nonprofit, keeping the practical compass of someone who knows how things are kept running. The retired lawyer told me, at a small dinner, "You wanted to be heard. That was the first thing you did right." I smiled and did not correct him. Maybe it was the first thing I had done right in a long time. The final, private reversal was quieter than any shareholder vote. It happened the night I walked back into the house. Not to reclaim a role, or to perform a reconciliation, but to collect items that had been my mother's and my sister's from a locked closet that, absurdly, held decades of family letters. The house smelled of old paper and lemon cleaner. I walked through rooms that had once felt like traps. Seeing objects that had once symbolized belonging now felt like seeing artifacts of a life I had outgrown. I put the letters in a box, and carried them out into the evening. On the front steps, my father stood in the dark with his hands in his coat pockets. He did not say much. He handed me a small notebook he had kept of business notes and, when I took it, his hand brushed mine in a way I had not felt in years. It was not an apology, it was a starting point. Whatever his regrets, they would be his to learn. The last public chapter was not about me triumphing and them falling. It was about legal processes and governance changes and people facing investigators and, for some, consequences that were just and proportionate. Those were not my joys to relish. I made sure my joy was reserved for work that moved forward. The nonprofit's first outreach, a talk I gave about workplace power and the invisibility of domestic labor. A small dinner with friends who had stayed. The final confessional voice I offered, the one that brought this all full circle, is not the voice of someone demanding vengeance. It is the voice of someone who has been pushed, who has been judged, and who has chosen to live differently. I will tell you, plainly, being called a murderer by your own kin is an experience that remakes you. It carves out pieces of yourself, and gives you the chance to choose what to keep and what to let go. I almost lost everything because people I loved preferred a tidy narrative to the messy truth. That should terrify anyone who lives their life in submission to prestige and image. What I learned is this. Truth is not always loud. It is painstaking. It is a stack of files. The testimony of a nurse, a technician's invoice, a guard who chooses to tell the truth despite fear. It is the stubbornness of a few people who will not let a lie settle. When truth is assembled carefully, when it is given shelter in law and in the public square, it can overturn even the most polished falsehood. If you are watching this because you identify with being dismissed, bullied, or framed in places where love and power intersect, I want to say something small and fierce. Do not let the silence they want from you be the shape of your life. Gather what you can, seek allies, and insist that processes be followed. I do not romanticize the cost, but truth is worth the cost because it gives you a future that is not built on the shrapnel of lies. I am not naive. The world is made of people who will choose their convenience over justice. I am not vengeful. I have no appetite to watch destruction for sport. I do want the world I live in to weigh truth more heavily than reputation. That is the work I do now, quietly and deliberately. To the people who helped me, Thank you. To those who turned away, I forgive what I can forgive. To anyone who has ever had their life rewritten by someone else's hand, you deserve to speak. If this story moved you, like and subscribe to follow the aftermath. And tell us in the comments what you would have done if you were in my place.